Morning everybody, we're doing Facebook Live midweek thought for the day. It's coming from the study this morning and I'm not so convinced about the lighting in here, so we'll see how that goes as we go on. I might get brighter, I might not. It depends if the sun comes out or not. So we're continuing today with our thinking about the progress that we were going to do for the confirmation classes for the confirmation on the 18th of May, even though I haven't been told officially, but I am assuming that's not happening. So we're coming to think about Pentecost, which in one way it's a bit early to think about Pentecost because Pentecost is not for a bit longer, but already, so last week the reading that we had from on Sunday was Peter talking at Pentecost. So the Pentecost is the day when the Holy Spirit came. We talked about the ascension last week. So Pentecost came, the disciples had been waiting, and so the reading for Pentecost is from Acts chapter 2 and beginning from verse 1, and we'll go through to 13. When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place, and suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues as of fire appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them ability. Now there were devout Jews from every nation under heaven living in Jerusalem, and at this sound the crowd gathered and was bewildered, because each one heard them speaking in the native language of each. Amazed and astonished, they asked, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear each of us in our own native language?" Parthians, Medes, Elamites and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs, in our own languages we hear them speaking about God's deeds of power. All were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" But others sneered and said, "They are filled with new wine." So that's the reading for Pentecost. That's what happened at Pentecost. And I've treated myself during lockdown to some new Kindle books. And one of those is a new Godly Play book. And I really like the Godly Play books because they join things together and they talk about things in a way which maybe I've not thought about before, or I need reminding about. So I was looking at the way that Godly Play talked about Pentecost and what they would do. Now, I'm not going to do it, although you might think I should be. The first thing that they suggest that you do when you're talking about Pentecost for Godly Play is that you actually build a tower of blocks. So they have their lesson materials in a box, and it would be a red box. I'm wearing my red cardigan, right colour for Pentecost. We're still actually technically in Easter, but Pentecost is a red colour. That's the colour for Pentecost. So they say this is the mystery of Pentecost, and then they build a tower, and they start building the Tower of Babel. So the Tower of Babel is one of the stories in Genesis, which is one of the stories which tries to explain what it is to be human, what it means to be human. So before we get to Abraham, all the things that are written down are to do with being human and trying to understand what it means to be human. And this is the last of those stories before we get to Abraham. So the Godly Play story says it like this. There was once a great tower. Everyone working on the tower spoke the same language and worked together. But as the tower grew taller and taller, they began to talk in different ways. The tower came close to God, and the people forgot why they were building it. They grew so proud of themselves that they began to think that they were greater builders than God. Each group thought it was better than any of the others. A huge noise replaced their talking. It made no sense. Everyone was babbling. Soon the tower fell down, so it was called the Tower of Babel. The language of the people of the earth was shattered and broke into splinters. Each one was beautiful, but it was broken. Oh, I really like the words that Jerome has chosen there about language and about how actually this is part of division and how we're divided by language. Sometimes we think about language being a common language, but actually sometimes language is divisive, and that's kind of what the Babel story was trying to tell us, that the language was it was kind of split up, where it was split up and defined into our tribes in that way. So that was a really good way of thinking about it. Soon the tower fell down, so it was called the Tower of Babel. The language of the people of the earth was shattered and broke into splinters. Each one was beautiful, but it was broken. Then it goes on to talk about the passing of time. It says, thousands of years passed. Then Jesus died on the cross, but somehow he was still with the people around him as he is with us. They kept seeing him and they couldn't let him go. Then one day something happened. Then it goes on to talk about the ascension, which we talked about last week. Jesus then went up, and soon the Holy Spirit would come down. The 11 disciples went back into the city. They were full of joy and went to the temple to pray. Then they went to the upper room, and with God's help, they decided that Matthias would take Judas's place. So then we get to Pentecost Sunday itself in this story. And remember, we've started with the Tower of Babel. On Sunday, the 12 were together again. Suddenly there was a sound like a mighty wind rushing in to be with them. It was the Holy Spirit. They became so full of its power that they seemed to be on fire. Their tongues burned in their mouths. They were so excited that people wondered what was going on. When the disciples went out on the street, these people there were from many different countries. They spoke many different languages. Everyone could see that the 12 had come close to God, and God had come close to them in a new way. It no longer mattered that they spoke different languages. The disciples had become apostles. They went out into all the world to tell this story. Ever since, Pentecost has been celebrated to remember that day. I love the way that it talks about in this story about, uses the phrase, it no longer mattered that they spoke different languages. We've had a lot of division in the world. I mean, that's partly what the Tower of Babel story is about. It's about trying to explain what it means for us to be divided as humans and what happens when we build ourselves into separate groups of people. And Pentecost is about that not mattering, about us all being unified and being brought back together again as God's people. It's interesting, at the end of the Bible passage it does say that some people thought that the disciples were drunk, which I always find very strange logically, because if I know one thing about being drunk, it does not give you fluency in other languages. But it is interesting that some people could see what was going on and could hear, and some people were just babbling. But Pentecost is about unity and a lack of division, a lack of that kind of animosity that's built up, and we see in the Babel story that the Babel story explains to us and underlines for us. With all good godly play sessions, you have a series of questions, and these are really good practice for any time that you read the Bible. They're very, very good practice. They're not exactly the same as exam questions, but they are very good practice questions. So these are the standard godly play questions. I wonder what part of this story you like best. I wonder what the most important part could be. I wonder where you are in the story, what part of the story is about you. I wonder if we can leave out any part of this story and still have all the story we need. I wonder if you have ever come close to something like this. I wonder if there is anything in our church that reminds you of this. So Pentecost, a story about division being healed, brokenness being brought back together. So that's our thought for the day for midweek for this week. Today there'll be Zoom service on Sunday morning, and so if you'd like to go on the Zoom mailing list, then please do that. Otherwise, I will see you all soon. Message me if you'd like to. It'd be great to speak to you. Bye.